When Aileen Wuornos finally began to talk, what surfaced was not a neat motive, but a mind built on grievance, suspicion, and a habit of turning every human encounter into a test of danger, control, or survival. In her case, the most disturbing pattern was not simply that 7 men were shot to death on Florida highways in 1989 and 1990, but that the killer carried a private script in which rage, fear, self-justification, and predation could all occupy the same sentence. Wuornos matters because her crimes sit at the intersection of serial murder, trauma, prostitution, manipulation, and the legal argument over self-defense, forcing investigators and psychologists to confront a killer who did not fit the public's usual image of a serial predator. She was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, and almost from the beginning her life was marked by abandonment. Her father was later convicted of child molestation and killed himself in prison, while her mother left Aileen and her brother behind to be raised by their grandparents. Accounts of her childhood describe violence, humiliation, instability, and early sexual exploitation, with friends saying her grandfather beat her, her grandmother struggled with alcoholism, and Wuornos herself began trading sexual favors for money, cigarettes, and beer by the age of 11. At 14, she gave birth to a child who was placed for adoption, and around the same period she was pushed out of the home and drifted into a transient life of hitchhiking, sleeping outdoors, and surviving through deception and sex work. That history did not create a murderer by itself, but it did help shape the emotional architecture investigators and clinicians later saw in her. Deep mistrust, explosive anger, chronic instability, impulsivity, and a worldview in which intimacy and threat were almost impossible to separate. Later case studies and courtroom testimony linked her behavior to borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, post-traumatic stress, alcoholism, and possible brain damage, though experts differed sharply on how much those conditions impaired her judgment. What stands out is that Wuornos did not move through life like someone seeking peace. She moved like someone braced for injury, then increasingly willing to become the source of it. By the early 1980s, after her brother died of cancer, she had relocated to Florida and accumulated arrests for firearm possession, forgery, assault, robbery, and prostitution, building a record that showed volatility long before the murders began. Associates and officers repeatedly described her as erratic, angry, and difficult, and even those routine notes suggest the personality that had stopped merely adapting to chaos and had started to inhabit it. In 1986, she met Tyria Moore at a bar in Daytona Beach, and the relationship became intense, emotionally dependent, and financially unstable, with the two women later connected to stolen goods sold at Florida pawn shops. The murders emerged from that unstable life with chilling practicality. From late 1989 through late 1990, 7 middle-aged white men connected to Florida roadways, vehicles, and transient encounters were robbed and shot to death, while their cars and personal property were taken and moved through a chain of resale, concealment, and abandonment. The first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old shop owner killed in 1989, and the later victims were David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, Troy Burris, Dick Humphreys, and Walter Antonio. Seams's body was never found, but his disappearance was still tied to the same pattern of theft, vehicle movement, and contact with Wuornos. Her method revealed a great deal about her psychology. Wuornos selected men she encountered while working as a prostitute along Florida highways. Men who were often older, mobile, and unlikely to be linked together quickly across counties, then folded murder into robbery with a blunt efficiency that reduced each encounter to leverage, risk, and disposal. She did not build an elaborate fantasy world or ritualized scene in the way some serial killers do. Instead, her pattern suggests something colder and more improvisational. A killer who converted opportunistic contact into domination and then into movement, always chasing the next escape route. The shootings, the thefts, and the resale of property all point to someone who could rationalize violence as necessity while using it repeatedly enough to make that rationalization part of her operating system. The victims deserve to be named without being reduced to scenery in her story. Richard Mallory was the first man linked to the series, and his case became the center of the first trial. David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burris, Dick Humphreys, Walter Antonio, and Peter Seams each represented another point in a pattern that law enforcement eventually understood as one offender moving through Florida. At first, that pattern was hard to see because the crimes were scattered across central Florida. The victims were adult men traveling alone, and the offender's lifestyle made her difficult to pin to one stable place or one stable identity. The investigation began to sharpen when police discovered items belonging to Richard Mallory in a pawn shop, and a receipt connected to those items carried Wuornos's thumbprint. That single print mattered because it pulled the case out of rumor and into a physical chain of proof. Investigators then traced more of Mallory's stolen property, including a camera found in a rented storage unit opened with a key taken from Wuornos, and learned that she had rented the unit under an alias. The killer, who imagined herself mobile and untouchable, had started leaving behind a commercial map of her own behavior: receipts, pawned items, storage space, and a repeatable trail of post-crime decisions. The turning point was Tyria Moore. By 1990, Moore had grown suspicious enough to leave Florida and stay with family in Pennsylvania. And after Wuornos was arrested on an outstanding warrant at a biker bar in Harbor Oaks in January 1991, police tracked Moore down and used her cooperation to draw out a confession. That detail is crucial because it exposed something central in Wuornos's psychology. For all her hostility toward authority, she still remained vulnerable to the emotional gravity of the one relationship she seemed desperate not to lose. Her downfall did not come from some grand forensic net alone. It came from the simple fact that the person closest to her became part of the pressure closing in. Wuornos had a long history of violence, instability, weapons trouble, robbery, and prostitution arrests. Yet none of those fragments triggered the kind of sustained intervention that might have changed the trajectory before 7 men were dead. Her childhood was saturated with abuse, neglect, sexual trauma, and expulsion, and society's response was not protection, but drift, criminalization, and neglect of a person who was already becoming dangerous. At the same time, the men she encountered lived inside a social zone where shame, secrecy, and transient movement slowed the formation of a clear public alarm. When the case reached court, it stopped being only about what Wuornos had done and became a battle over what she believed while doing it. In the Mallory trial, in January 1992, she was convicted of first-degree murder and armed robbery with a firearm, and the jury later recommended death by a 12-0 vote. Defense experts testified that she suffered from borderline personality disorder, extreme emotional disturbance, and evidence of brain damage. While the state's psychologist agreed on borderline traits, but also diagnosed antisocial personality disorder, and argued that her impairment was not substantial enough to excuse the killing. The trial revealed a woman who could present herself as damaged, enraged, persecuted, and defiant all at once, but the legal system ultimately treated her not as a symbol of trauma, but as a calculating serial murderer. She was convicted in additional murder cases through 1992 and 1993, and the timeline of those verdicts reinforced the image of a sustained killing pattern rather than a single explosive act of self-defense. Wuornos became one of the most debated examples of how trauma, gender, and predatory violence can coexist without canceling one another out. Researchers used her case to argue over attachment failure, psychopathy, predatory aggression, and the limits of trauma as explanation, while the public often preferred a simpler story than the evidence allowed. Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in Florida on October 9, 2002. By then, she had become one of the most infamous female serial killers in American history. But that label can obscure the harder truth. Her case is less useful as myth than as a study in how a life shaped by brutality can still harden into deliberate brutality against others. She was not a folk avenger, and she was not merely a broken drifter. She was a repeat killer whose inner world had become so saturated with grievance and distortion that murder could be reframed again and again as necessity. What remains is the lesson investigators still return to. Patterns matter, resale trails matter, relationships matter, and psychology matters most when it is examined without romance. The case also forced broader discussion about how female serial offenders are perceived, how trauma is presented in court, and how easily public fascination can blur the line between explanation and excuse. And behind all of that are 7 dead men whose names should not be swallowed by the notoriety of the woman who killed them. If you want more true crime stories told with facts and context, subscribe, like this video, and comment with the case you want covered next.